In March 1974, Philip Kindred Dick, a science fiction writer, went through a series of extrasensory experiences that remain unexplained to this day. The subject himself later referred to these events as an encounter with God and used it as a storyline for some of his novels. You have been entrusted to determine the true nature of these events. At present day, the writings of Philip K. Dick have reached considerable levels of popularity for what was considered a cult writer, and many of his stories have been adapted to film, such as Blade Runner, Total Recall, and Minority Report. Gentlemen, the future circulation of his work will be based on the results of your investigation. We will start at the beginning.
The subject of this speech is a topic which has been discovered recently and which may not exist at all. I may be talking about something that does not exist. Therefore, I'm free to say everything or nothing.
He was born in 1928, which was really in the middle of not quite the end of the Big Depression in this country. So his mother was poor, lucky to have a job. And of course, the death of the little girl certainly had a tremendous effect on Dorothy, too.
They had been born about 2 months early, and they were both very small. And at the time, Phil was one of the smallest premature babies to survive. But his sister was even smaller, and she simply did not make it.
He thought that she should have lived, and he died. He thought that he was living at her expense.
Dorothy couldn't afford very much milk for them, and Phil was always so hungry that she gave him more than she gave to Phil's sister. So Phil felt in some ways that it was his fault that his sister died.
And at the same time, he developed a personality in his mind about how she would be if she had lived. And into that personality, he injected all sorts of things from what we'd call the feminine side of his personality. He actually drew her picture several times for me. But the pictures, they looked a lot like him. It was like him on a diet.
He felt a connection with what might have been. And since a lot of his writing has to do with the nature of reality, I think that had a very strong effect on it. You know, what might have been. The changing information which we experience as world is an unfolding narrative. It tells about the death of a woman. This woman, who died long ago, was one of the primordial twins. The purpose of the narrative is the recollection of her and of her death. The mind does not wish to forget her.
I can see him in my mind's eye. I can see him as he was then. Sick quite a lot of the time. He was a sickly boy. We went to grade school together at Hillside School in Berkeley. I wasn't aware of any mental problems, but I was aware that he was quite a strange boy, and I liked that.
He lived with his mother. Dicks were divorced. Father lived in San Mateo, and Mrs. Dick, I don't think I ever saw her fully clothed and vertical. She was always resting in bed early in the evening.
I only remember seeing his mother in the kitchen once, and she was making a melted cheese sandwich. And to think of it, I never saw him eat anything. And that's strange, because, you know, kids that age are eating all the time and drinking all the time. And then I saw her feed the cat sometimes, but never got into a good conversation with her.
In the early 1930s, young Philip and his mother Dorothy settled in Berkeley, California. It is said that his mother encouraged Philip's early interest for literature. But it is also undeniable that the intellectual environment of the city of Berkeley had an impact in the child's development.
I know that Philip was writing in high school, and that he wrote short stories. And early on, he had a little story published in the local newspaper, which had a column for kids' stories. I have never seen that story. I would love to see it. I don't know anything about it except it was a science fiction-y story.
Started having a lot of anxiety attacks going to high school, sweats, palpitations, shortness of breath. They considered it anxiety. Now we probably would think more panic disorder, panic attacks, and those are different. Started to write science fiction to disassociate. That was his word, to escape.
The question of when Phil and I discovered fantasy, I think we first discovered it in comic books. Here's a classic. We were all comic book collectors. And we went quite quickly from comic books to pulp magazines. At that time, there were a great many cheap fiction magazines. And Phil and I were both collectors.
Oh, we were both nerds. We both sort of liked classical music so much. And he had this great advantage of living in a strange arrangement with his mother. His mother lived upstairs, and the downstairs, the living room, with a huge Magnavox. And we had that to ourselves every afternoon and into the night, where we could listen to Beethoven, Brahms.
When Philip was in high school, he got his first regular job at University Radio. University Radio at that time was strictly radios, and then as time went on, they sold television sets too. The owner of University Radio also owned Art Music. Art Music, the other store that Herb Hollis owned, was closer to the campus, the university campus, and was all records. And since Philip was mostly interested in the music, after his high school days, he and Hollis had a good relationship, almost a father-son relationship. And Philip was moved up to Art Music, where he knew what he was talking about and was interested in what he was doing, selling the music.
And then when he really blossomed out and got to know people when he started working at the record store, just taught him how to deal with people. I always had the feeling he must be working in the basement because he was so afraid of other people. But no, he was a good salesman. He liked people. He could pick up girls there.
You know, he was married once before me. It lasted just a few months.
Oh, he told me that story that it was the first girl he slept with and he thought he had her pregnant and that's why he got married. But I didn't believe that because that sounded, too good to be true as a story.
His story about why that marriage broke up was that his wife, Jeanette, who nobody's been able to trace since, I have no idea if she's still alive or nobody ever heard of her after that in his circle. The story was that Jeanette had a brother who came to visit the apartment, and Philip had a huge record collection, and Jeanette's brother had objections to that, and he didn't think a real man should be that hung up on music, and that Philip felt that the collection was actually threatened, physically threatened, and that's why they broke up. Now, I doubt that was really the whole story, but that's the story he told. He started at the University of California and didn't stay a full semester, and he was virtually self-taught. He loved literature, and He was very interested in psychology and science and you name it. So he really gave himself a pretty good education, which stood him in good stead, I think, later on. And in any case, whatever happened, he dropped out of the university. So here he was on his own, living in his own apartment by this time, in the middle of a university setting with university kids coming by all the time, like myself, to the music store. And that was our major connection initially, was through the music. He would recommend things that he thought I would like to hear, and it was a very musical courtship. They had listening booths, which were very private, and we had musical discussions often. But at any rate, it was the music that drew us together. After about 1.5 years, we got married, and that's substantially how we got together.
On June 14th, 1950, Philip K. Dick married Cleo, his second wife, and together they lived in a modest house at 1126 Francisco Street. It was at this time that Philip decided to become a professional writer. His wife was very supportive, and his marriage created a perfect working environment.
He felt that somebody would buy his stuff. He knew the magazines very well, and he knew he was writing very well. And we both knew that he would be published at some point.
And Phil, at that time, he wrote a lot of short stories, one right after the other, real fast. And they all sold because they were pretty good. Some of them, the very first story he wrote in the science fiction style, sold.
Anthony Boucher was the editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and he had been publishing stories for years. And Philip sent him some stuff, and he was very encouraging, and in fact bought the first story, the story that they called Friday Morning, which was originally called Rogue. Spiffer was an Australian Shepherd, probably at least 8 or 9 years old, and, you know, black and white, beautiful dog. And the dog would run across here. So in Philip's story, there was a dog very much like Spiffer who realized that what people called garbage men were actually Roogs, R-O-O-G, and that's what he was calling. He wasn't just barking. See, he was saying, Roog, Roog. So, and he tries to protect the family from the Roogs. He doesn't know if the Roogs intend to eat everybody or if they are only eating the garbage. All he knows is they're taking the garbage away and storing it somewhere. And that's Spiffer's story. Wonderful dog, gosh.
I would say that the main theme in Phil's fantasy writing is the uncertainty of reality. That's something he comes back to time and again. There are people who believe one thing is true and it turns out not to be true. And that occurrence, that discovery, usually an unpleasant discovery of the reality being other than we think it is, that is the big fat thread that all of the other threads are attached to, I think.
What's real and what is unreal is the basis, of course, of Philip's stuff, and is the basis, I think, of any decent fiction writer's stuff.
One thing that puzzled Phil Dick throughout his life, he never quite trusted reality. He was never sure this table was going to be a table in the next minute.
And he was also a pioneer in having a deep skepticism about the nature of reality. And that's the aspect of Dick's work that I think makes him seem so peculiarly contemporary.
How do I know that my internal view of reality is real? Then you have a Philip kind of situation. There are many realities, maybe, or Are we like flies? And we see with a lot of different lenses. Maybe it's all the same thing we're seeing, and maybe it isn't. You know, maybe there are as many realities as lenses in a fly's eye.
He had a rather complex psychological life. He had numerous nervous breakdowns, whatever that means. He went to see a psychiatrist as a teenager. He had various phobias, agoraphobia, eating phobias, and so forth. And he also himself felt and worked out in his fiction a profound sense that the boundary between his inside psychological life and the exterior world was not altogether clear-cut and unambiguous, that boundary was a shifting boundary, and to some extent maybe even indeterminate.
And then the hallucination, if it was that, happened. He saw the personal manager in a new light. The man was dead. He saw through the man's skin his skeleton. It had been wired together, the bones connected with fine copper wire. The man's voice issued from a tape, through an amplifier and a speaker system. That was when panic overtook him.
One of the most stunning days in our lives at that time was Philip sent out stories all the time to all kinds of magazines, not only science fiction, but all over. And they'd come back, you know, and we'd send them out again. The post office is right down the street. And one day there were 17 manuscripts returned in the mailbox, in and around the mailbox. And it was a real blow. So we solved it by picking them all up, marking which ones had gone to what place, you know, and when they'd been returned. And just, you know, we put them in new envelopes and sent them all out again. That was hard. That was hard.
They were poor. Phil was very poor for most of his life. It was funny. At one point, I think it was when he was married to Cleo, he was so poor that he couldn't afford human food. He had to go to a pet store and buy, what was it called? Happy Dog food. They had a capital P in front of the word poor.
I think that Philip always had a feeling, unfounded, I believe, that he might never be able to live off his writing. When he started to sell stuff, it was, of course, wonderful. But the early stories, he got, I believe, as little as $80 for one. Not very much money to appear in some of these magazines.
And his agent told him that he wasn't ever going to make any money, no matter how many short stories he sold. He should write novels. So Phil obediently got started writing novels. In the back of Phil's head was the idea that this was just a stepping stone to becoming a great novelist in the general sense of the word, known to the general public, because he was known a lot by science fiction fandom.
In 1955, Philip K. Dick's first novel, Solar Lottery, was published. The city of Berkeley was thriving with student demonstrations and the politically left-wing ideas of Marxism and communism. Although Dick tried to distance himself from these more radical political views, the atmosphere contributed to his already existing paranoid tendencies.
Phil had contact with the FBI early in his college career because he joined a communist student club, and this was the McCarthy era, when communists were evil and they were going to take over the world. At least that's what we thought. So the FBI came to him not knowing that he was a member of this club, but asking him to spy on his wife Cleo because she belonged to a communist student group.
When the FBI showed up on our doorstep, wanting information about the political meetings at Sather Gate, which I always went to, on any side of the political line. That was pretty scary, except that they were so inept. And you tended to laugh at them. These FBI men on their spurious investigations. I mean, to come, to our house and ask me my political orientation was absurd. They visited us 2 or 3 times. They said who they were, started bringing out pictures to show me, did I know this one, that one, this one, that one? And each time after they left, we would be shaking our heads about how klutzy they were. And when George Scruggs, the main guy, turned out to be such a nice man and taught Philip how to drive, it lessened the effects a little bit. He seemed to take an almost fatherly role with Philip, which was great because he always was able to use a good father figure. But he was a very nice man. And nothing ever came of it after that, except that Philip used that situation in writing a few times.
And now a lot of his biographers said Phil was paranoid. And all these were fears that were groundless fears. In the 60s, they were not groundless fears. There were federal agents who were taking pictures of people. It later came out that wasn't a delusion. They really were doing that. And they really were compiling dossiers on people like me and Phil, even though we were not prominent in the peace movement. And Phil was one of those people, and I don't think it was a delusion at all. I think he really was what they call an object of interest to the FBI.
At that point, Philip had been working at a different music store. And there was no reason to stay in Berkeley. So we sold the house in Berkeley and moved to Point Reyes Station. One day, this lady appeared at the door who had been married to a poet who turned out actually was a wonderful poet. And that poet had died, and she had heard this kind of literary type had moved into the neighborhood, and she wanted to make a connection, which sounded great to us. From there, a different kind of relationship developed between Philip and her, and one day he announced that he was going to move over to her place.
I had heard this writer had moved to town, and I was interested in meeting him and his wife, and we just hit it off. We had instant communication, and the next thing you know, we were involved with each other.
During the first years of his marriage to Anne Rubenstein, Philip K. Dick temporarily abandoned science fiction writing to concentrate on his mainstream novels. He rented a small cabin in the country that he named The Hovel, and there he spent months writing, hoping to achieve literary success.
During the period when he was writing his mainstream novels and living with Anne, he took amphetamines every day. And he did that so that he could write a lot. He thought that he didn't want to waste his time sleeping, and these things would keep him from sleeping. And they also apparently accelerated his inspiration.
Towards the end of our marriage, he was taking tons of stuff. And again, I didn't find that out until after he left. And I got a bill from the druggist for all these strange things. But he could always talk some doctor into giving him whatever he wanted to have. And he knew more about the drugs than the doctors did.
I know that he had a lot of prescriptions in our home, like tons of them. And so I remember seeing those, and I think I remember him taking prescriptions, yeah.
At night, he would take amphetamines and he would write. In the daytime, he would help Anne with her jewelry business. She was setting up a jewelry business. Anne made jewelry, and Phil made some of the jewelry himself. And so he would write, and he would work on the jewelry business, night, day, and then he would collapse, and he would sleep for 24 hours or longer and then start over again.
He came home from riding at the Hubble, and he'd seen this, said he saw this face in the sky.
Gentlemen, this is critical to your investigation. For weeks, Dick was tormented by the sight of a giant metallic face in the sky, an image that would become the basis for his novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. But was it merely an hallucination, or was it something more?
I don't know what was happening. He was writing The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and I think he was trying to work out in that book an enormous conflict he had in his own life.
That's about an evil god. Palmer Eldritch is an evil god, but he's like Christ in that he manifests through stigmata and that he controls the universe. He controls reality to a certain point.
He started out by being an evil creature coming from outer space, and everyone he touched became a Palmer Eldritch. He sort of was like an infection, a horrible infection.
Phil himself didn't like that book because it was a fearsome view of reality. He was almost convinced that God was evil or indifferent to human suffering.
Phil had a strong belief in God, the creator of this world, but he believed, as many offshoots of Christianity do believe, that this world was created by an evil or inferior God, and that the actual one God is trying to save us from this imperfect world.
Well, here we were going to the church, and he's writing a book that's basically sacrilegious. And it was shocking to see the two, I guess I was seeing these two sides of Philip that I wasn't really aware of in everyday life.
He was very passionate about going to church, and he got all dressed up in his suit, and we all had to be dressed up. It was something he took really seriously.
Phil joined the Episcopal Church when he was married to Anne, and they attended the Episcopal Church quite regularly up in Marin County.
We decided to go. We were trying to patch our marriage up, which was falling to pieces, and decided to go to the church. And he seemed to really like it. And he seemed to stay interested in religion for the rest of his life. You were wrong, Eldritch said. I did not find God in the Prox system, but I found something better. God, Eldritch said, promises eternal life. I can do better. I can deliver it. What's that? Eldritch asked. A King James Bible? I thought it might help protect me. Not here, Eldritch said. This is my domain. He gestured at the Bible and it vanished.
Phil liked Anne particularly because she was the ex-wife of the editor of a magazine that was published in New York. And they were the first publishers of Allen Ginsberg, and it was a highly respected magazine. And this guy, who was Anne's ex-husband, was a highly respected literary figure. And Phil's idea was that some of that would rub off on him. And while he was living with her, he wrote a whole series of mainstream novels that were basically intended to please her.
You know, he had this woman in the novels over and over and over that was a murderess and an adulteress, and they were all based on me. These novels of the 60s. And I did find that a little disturbing. And then Confessions of a Crap Artist, which he wrote on our honeymoon. I mean, I read that and I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't know what to say, because it's a portrait of this woman that I didn't feel was me, but she wore my clothes. She had my appearance. It was a halfway autobiographical book. Somebody said that book should have been a warning to you.
I don't want to play amateur psychologist, but I think she was part of a dream that failed to come true. That dream that he had of being with Anne on his elbow and signing autographs at the big bookstores in New York, that never came true. And it was really hard for him to accept that.
What happened was that we fought a lot and yelled, and I threw things. And then we were both going to a psychiatrist who my first husband had gone to for marriage therapy. And Philip just charmed that psychiatrist. He thought Philip was, he loved him. He was not in love with him. He wasn't gay or anything, but he loved him. And so Philip wove his little web, and the next thing I know, the sheriff came and took me off to the mental hospital.
You know, I think he just said your mother needs help, you know, she needs to go someplace where she can get help. But obviously, we lived in a small town, an ambulance came to get her. At that time when you were committed, it was against your will and you had no say.
For me, it was just totally crushing. I mean, it was a terrible stigma, even though it was sort of an interesting experience.
However, my mother could act pretty crazy. And he acted just as crazy, so they probably both should have been there together.
And Philip kept saying, it's me who's nuts. I'm the one that should be in there. Well, maybe that was true.
My mother's really eccentric, a really strong person, and liked to have her way. He was a really strong person and had his very strong beliefs and ideas. But I know that when they were having a disagreement, like, you wanted to run and hide because it was like, the house was going to fall down.
And then he started running off and going to stay at his mother's. And then he'd come back, or I'd go get him, and he'd come back. And he must have come back and run off about 17 times. He was going through a period of great turmoil.
And he was teetering back and forth. He was on the phone with Ann. He was off the phone. He was calling her a grunk. And then he was rhapsodizing about how sophisticated she was. And finally, he phoned her and said he wanted to be reconciled with her. Would she come to Oakland? So she said, sure, I'll come. And she came. Ann turns up at the front door. Phil pulls a revolver and said, go away, I never want to see you again. And Ann runs away crying.
He had this little gun. He was pointing at me. It was very frightening. He says that he was having the major nervous breakdown of his life later on. But I think also he felt like he was a danger to me and the girls, and that was really maybe the main reason that he left. He condemned himself, sort of. I was very angry at him for a long time. I don't know if I hated him. No, I don't think I hated him. I was angry at him for leaving me. It's a terrible thing to do to your wife and children. You know, I mean, it really, everyone was very hurt.
He met a family, Hackett, I believe that was their name, and he formed a big crush on the elder of two sisters. But the elder of the two sisters thought he was nuts and wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he, as a second choice, he took Nancy Hackett and married her.
Nancy, oh, Nancy came out here with her, she was 19 years old. She came out here with her stepmother, who was our friend from St. Columba's Church, a very brilliant woman. And later on, he was going to marry Nancy.
64, 65, the woman of the hour is Nancy, who had just been discharged from a mental hospital. He describes her as scared, brittle, 21, and schizophrenic. She became pregnant, he married her.
She's 19 years old, didn't say anything, didn't do anything. I don't know whether she was on some kind of drugs or what, but she had a very hard life, very difficult life. She had a real mental illness.
In July 1966, Philip K. Dick marries Nancy Hackett. While living in San Rafael, their daughter Isolde is born. With a growing religious interest, he forms a close relationship with Bishop James Pike of the Episcopal Church.
He was in the process, along with the rest of the Bay Area, of searching for a new religion. He and Jim Pike, the bishop, they were both looking for something that even unbelievers can believe in.
I think that Phil got a lot of his ideas about religion from Bishop Pike, and Pike had a lot of unorthodox ideas.
Jim Pike was, on the cover of Time magazine, and, very significant, big connection with the anti-war movement and things like this.
Bishop Pike was tried for heresy himself for trying to prove that Jesus did not die on the cross.
Jim was in deep trouble with his church for that, and I guess it was 1966 that he quit the church, or was forced out, depending on how you look at it, because of being too heretical.
Phil knew him so that he knew personal things about Jim Pike. He knew about Jim Pike's mistress, that Jim Pike paid out of the bishop's discretionary fund, the apartment where she lived and things like this.
And he was getting very heretical at that point, because the thing between Phil and him was Phil had this idea of an evil God, and Jim had this idea of a good God. And then Jim's son committed suicide. What kind of a universe is it when the bishop's son kills himself? Is Phil right? Is there really an evil God just waiting to destroy us?
I, in my stories and novels, often write about counterfeit worlds, semi-real worlds, as well as deranged private worlds, inhabited often by just one person, while meantime the other characters either remain in their own worlds throughout or are somehow drawn into one of the peculiar ones. This theme occurs in the corpus of my 27 years of writing. At no time did I have a theoretical or conscious explanation for my preoccupation with these pluriform pseudo-worlds, but now I think I understand. What I was sensing was the manifold of partially actualized realities lying tangent to what evidently is the most actualized one, the one which the majority of us, by consensus gentium, agree on.
It was his karma that the world was stacked against him. And that if he could be put into an embarrassing position, fate would put him there.
I think what I was most sensitive about the fact was that he'd gone off on this trajectory of I thought it was sort of self-destructive, because when he was in our family home, he had family dinners and went to church and sort of had a semblance of a more average life. And then he just went off on this trajectory of sort of extreme behavior.
Nancy had a lot of friends who were involved in drugs and gang activities. There was one guy who was a poet and had a magazine, and he was also a drug pusher. And Phil was telling him about how much money he made. And the pusher says, "Why, I make more money in a week than you make in a year. Why don't you come over in my racket?" And Phil said, "Yeah, maybe so." And Nancy didn't like that. And so as he became more and more involved with the criminals, Nancy became more and more upset.
In August of 1970, Nancy takes their daughter and leaves the house in Santa Venetia. Depressed and driven by destructive behavior, Philip opens his house to the social outcast and the debauchery of young writers, bohemians, and junkies.
At the end of the 1960s, in Santa Venetia, San Rafael, Philip K. Dick found himself very directly influenced by the young people he was meeting around his home. And in fact, it started to be that people would come by. It was a place to hang out, or even a so-called crash pad, which meant that young people knew that they could sleep there if they needed a place to go and sleep.
After high school, I left home and became reacquainted with Dennis. and he was staying at Philip K. Dick's house. And I needed a place to stay at the time, and so he suggested that I stay there. And so then when I got over there, the atmosphere was, it was kind of like an open house, people coming and going, and it just seemed comfortable, though. But I was also very young. I wasn't even, yeah, I guess I was just 18, and it was kind of refreshing to be around an adult that didn't have any rules. You ate when you wanted, you ate what you wanted, you went to bed when you wanted. You stayed up all night if you wanted.
Oh, yes, I heard a lot of things. I mean, I just heard what a demise he was in and how he lived in a pigsty and had really bad, you know, not criminal, but drug addict friends and, you know, Hell's Angels.
70, 71, street drugs, he lost his house, hospitalized 3 times, drugs, and danger to self or others, which is called a 5150, 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. So Phil was going through some tough years in the 70s.
He wasn't writing. I know he wasn't writing at the time. He would just sit and entertain these people when they would come and go.
I think that because Philip K. Dick was an amphetamine user, his contact with the youth subculture probably came about partly because he was trying to buy amphetamine. And pretty soon he made friends in that world.
And then he started getting kind of paranoid about people like spying on him, and, you know, there was some instance of someone breaking into his home, and maybe that had to do with drugs. It probably did.
Early in 1971, Philip K. Dick's house in Santa Venetia was broken into by somebody who was looking for something he doesn't know. According to Phil, there was evidence that explosive had been used to try to break into his locked file cabinets that he kept his manuscripts in.
Everything that went on in that house seemed to make no sense to me. It was so different from what I thought of as reality. I wasn't used to seeing people doing drugs, and I wasn't used to all these, you know, break-ins and weird things that happened, and just every day was bizarre. I remember the big window here. It seemed like there were a lot of plants kind of covering it.
Yeah, well, with that covering, it made it so much darker. Were you aware of all his worries about FBI and things like that? I always wonder what room was broken into.
Oh, it was this room back here. There was a twin bed against the window, and then there was a bookcase against this wall, and there was a file cabinet, you know, one of those taller ones. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a...
That was before you were here, right? He told
No, I was here. Oh. I was here. I wasn't here when it got broken into, but I came over after, and I saw dust on the floor and footprints in the dust. And so then when I came back, all the doorknobs had been removed off the doors in the house, and there was plastic explosives, he said, in the room that was his office. And he said his file cabinet had been blown up and somebody had taken manuscripts, and all this crazy stuff had happened.
We know that at the time of the break-in, Philip K. Dick thought, "Thank God I'm not crazy. I have real enemies. It is a tremendous relief to discover that somebody really is after me." At this time, he became obsessed with discovering who his real enemies were.
He gave a lot of interviews saying that he thought the federal government maybe hit his house, or maybe it was this, or maybe it was that. There was a big article in Rolling Stone that Paul Williams edited that was all these different theories about what happened in his house.
When I interviewed Phil Dick for Rolling Stone, it was 1974, and Phil would talk about his many theories as to what had happened. He often guessed that the government was looking for information about him.
He wasn't simply making it up out of whole cloth. He did have the evidence of his house being broken into in an almost paramilitary style. His safe and a filing cabinet had been blown open by apparently very sophisticated explosives, and very selective things had been taken.
He suggested, for example, and I quoted in my Rolling Stone article, that there were things that he'd written in his science fiction novels that were too close to the truth, or that were frightening to the government in some way. And they wanted to know, how did he know? How did he know about that? He also was very aware of the Black Panthers who lived in the neighborhood.
He went through all these theories. It was the feds, it was the government, it was this, it was that, it was a drug hit.
Altogether, there was really a fairly substantial group of people that he could suspect, you know, might be malignantly after him. So it wasn't paranoia.
You know, here's a minor American writer, you know, a little genre guy getting published in these crappy little pulp magazines. The next thing you know, he's, you know, telling people about how the FBI is breaking in through his window, and, you know, some book he wrote somehow contained something real in it that the FBI was trying to cover up. I mean, that's been kind of a science fiction writer's legend for a long time.
And then he tells that the police theory was that he did it himself. He thought that was very funny. And so he made a big joke out of the police theory that Philip K. Dick had somehow brought in explosives and blown up his own files for some obscure reason.
Well, years later, he told me that he was pretty sure it was just because he was taking drugs at the time that it was a drug hit.
As you know, in the late 1960s, experimentation with mind-altering drugs became common among artists who sought new forms of expression. Philip K. Dick was no exception to this. His activity with psychedelics may have contributed to his extrasensory experiences.
The connection between drugs and what I was saying earlier about his skepticism about reality really finds expression in the LSD culture. People like Timothy Leary. The feeling that the experience one had under drugs was revealing that this is all an elaborate play being staged for our benefit to keep us politically quiescent. And drugs allow you to see behind that facade and realize that there is another reality.
But Phil only took LSD twice. And both times I gave it to him. And the first time he had quite a good experience. The second time he had a very bad experience in which he thought he was a gladiator in ancient Rome. And what happened to Phil was that even though he had never studied Latin, and I studied Latin in high school, so I could understand Latin, but he began speaking Latin when he was that gladiator. He was speaking good Latin, grammatically correct, but easygoing, as if he'd spoken it as a native tongue, and that was spooky.
In November of '71, he says, my house was hit, and he thinks it was the FBI that broke in and trashed his house. And so he fled to Canada, living in Vancouver, where he made, unfortunately, his first suicide attempt.
Phil Dick had gone to Vancouver in Canada in order to be guest of honor for a convention, and then when the convention ended, he just didn't come home. Later I found out, of course, that he had attempted suicide in Canada, and in order to sort of be living in a secure and monitored environment, had checked himself into a place called Ex-Calais, which was in fact a heroin rehab compound.
He said that's where the book, that's Scanner Darkly, you got the idea for it back then. The idea of drugs, you know, came from that.
And in fact, they did seem to have done him some good. The sort of closely monitored, very, very intensive care does seem to have been what he needed. And he eventually, in effect, outgrew the need for it, recovered, and was ready to sort of step back into civilization again.
Now and then a dealer, realizing he was about to be busted, took refuge in one of the drug rehabilitation places, like Synanon and Centerpoint and Ex-Calais and New Path, posing as an addict seeking help. Once inside, his wallet, his name, everything that identified him was stripped away in preparation for building up a new personality not drug-oriented. Then, later on, when the pressure was off, the dealer emerged and resumed his usual activity outside. I only got partial details about how Phil wound up down in Orange County. Phil had wanted to get out of that drug rehab place up in Canada, and Willis, helped make it possible.
When Vancouver stopped being feasible as a new place to live, he wrote to a professor at Cal State Fullerton and said, I have nowhere to live. My home back in California has been blown up. I'm virtually homeless. And the professor read Phil's letter to the class, and a couple of the students said, we just lost a roommate. We could use another roommate. And they said, would you like to come to the airport to pick up Philip K. Dick? And I said, yes, of course.
When I first met him, he was very, very friendly, very warm, very enthusiastic. He had an incredible, enthusiastic, bubbling personality. And I believe Tim Powers was one of Willis McNally's students who actually met Phil at the airport.
Well, when he stepped through the gate, we were waiting for him in the gate area of the airport there. He looked desperate. He was wearing a sport coat that was too short for him and too short in the shoulders. His luggage was held together with an electrical extension cord, and he was carrying a copy of the Bible, which later he said was to mollify customs. And of course, his old life in the Bay Area was really no longer an option since his marriage had broken up. His house had been melodramatically broken into and robbed. And even the police had, I believe, implied that they thought it would be a good idea if he went away and never came back.
Before I met Phil, I was simply trying to escape from my dysfunctional family. I was trying to decide whether to go to college or join the Navy. And I had no plans to get married or have children. But I went to this 4th of July party with people, and when I saw Phil, I just instantly fell in love with him. And we started talking, and we basically never separated after that until several years later when our marriage fell apart.
In 1973, Christopher Kenneth Dick is born. Gradually, Dick returns to his writing, and in a letter to a friend, describes his marriage to Tessa. He writes, "We are living in a Philip K. Dick novel." Only a few months later, in February of 1974, fiction would become fact.
Because Phil didn't like to drive, he started having the pharmacy deliver his prescriptions.
He had had dental surgery and he was in a lot of pain. And when the woman came to deliver his pain medication from the drugstore, the light flashed off her Christian fish symbol that she was wearing.
And when Phil saw that little gold necklace, it caught the light, probably sunlight.
And he was hit between the eyes with a beam of light, only it was no ordinary beam of light. It was, I don't know, a penetrating ray of some kind, although it did not hurt him.
And he saw this as a pink beam that initiated a fairly long period, several weeks at least, of what he mostly concluded, most often thought, was a contact with God.
And during this vision, he was given a knowledge that his infant son, Christopher, had a very serious hernia. and could die from it if the doctors did not treat it.
What happened in real life was that I noticed a problem when I was changing his diapers, so I took him to the doctor, and the doctor told me that I was not cleaning him well enough between diaper changes. And I knew that wasn't it, but about a month later, Phil had a vision while napping, and he came out to the living room and told me exactly what was wrong with Christopher. And I called up the doctor and made another appointment, and Phil was right, and I was right.
The doctor did indeed find a very severe inguinal hernia that could have been fatal had it not been treated, and the baby had immediate surgery.
This exact diagnosis of Christopher's illness causes some witnesses to believe that Philip K. Dick could have acquired information from outside his normal consciousness. Encouraged by these recurring visions, he now believes that reality is a projection that hides or conceals the ultimate truth. This theme is constant throughout his novels, but now in his real life, he believes this to be true.
In late February of 1974, I was given sodium pentothal for the extraction of impacted wisdom teeth. Later that day, back home again, but still deeply under the influence of the sodium pentothal, I had a short, acute flash of recovered memory. Then, in mid-March, a month later, the total body of memories, intact and entire, began to return. You are free to believe me or to disbelieve, but please take my word on it that I am not joking. This is very serious, a matter of importance.
For the rest of his life after that, the main concern of all his research was that God? If not, what else might it have been? And it resulted in some, of course, tremendous books. Mainly, I think, Valis was probably the most significant result of that experience.
The things that he talked about at the time, I mean, yeah, there was this theory he came up with about the Valis entity. Yeah, that was a theory, that his mystical experiences had been somehow a result of an encounter with this Valis thing.
At that time, I had no idea what I was seeing. It resembled nothing that I had ever heard described. It resembled plasmic energy. It had colors. It moved fast. It collected and then dispersed. But what it was, what he was, I am not sure even now.
VALIS is an acronym. It stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. In other words, he thought that the artificial intelligence should be called VALIS.
I know a lot of the communications he got were in a woman's voice. And he ascribed this to the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity.
I think for Phil, VALIS was a conduit to the information, not exactly to God himself, but to the information that would explain God in terms that he could understand. Because in our tradition, you cannot stand face to face with God. You would die. So you need an intermediary, and that would be the satellite voice or VALIS.
He told me that God had intervened into reality and talked to him. Then he told me that, in fact, that wasn't what happened. It was simply an acid flashback, that he was deluded to think it was God. Then he told me, no, it was probably Soviet experiments with telepathy that had happened. And then he'd say, no, I think it was God.
I thought that a lot of it was delusion. I'm sorry to say that, but I did. I mean, he would get glimpses, and he believed those glimpses. He believed them with all his heart. Like that hernia meant something. The girl with the fish sign meant something. I mean, this was all significant. I don't think he was sure how it fit together or what was going to happen or what he was supposed to do.
I think he believed more often than not that it was God that had happened to him. And I think that it was God that had happened to him. I don't think it was an acid flashback or Soviet telepathy experiments. I think that in fact what happened was that God leaned down and spoke to Phil Dick.
I've always felt, and still do, that if these are, things like this are the evidence that you base your convictions about reality upon, you must have a very desperate need to have some view of an alternate reality.
Well, if you believe, as I do, that people are aware of their impending deaths, that on some deep level they know they may be coming to the end of their lifetime, the need to find answers to lifelong questions in those circumstances becomes especially pressing and urgent. And so it's no mystery, I think, why Dick would take this process of projection, which has always been in his work, and find some kind of ultimate affirmation in that. That science fiction becomes the ultimate reality. Well, what more validation would a science fiction writer need?
As far as whether these visions really happened, they did really happen to Phil. But as Phil would say, what is reality? Or as a great Zen Buddhist once said, am I the man dreaming he's a butterfly, or the butterfly dreaming that he's a man?
Certainly it's accurate to say that from 74 until his death in 82, he was trying to find an answer to what had happened to him in March of 74.
Phil became more and more absorbed with trying to understand the meaning of that flash when that pink ray zapped him in the eyes, and he began to write things based on his theories about the meaning of that flash.
For the rest of his life, he was trying to understand what happened to him, what God was trying to tell him, and I think that's what that whole exegesis was about.
Exegesis is a word for writings that attempt to explain the scriptures, especially the Bible, but also the scriptures of other traditions like Hinduism and Islam and Buddhism.
First, he would examine possibility A, that it was something that somehow was consistent with the Buddhist view of reality, and then he would see that something still didn't fit in with that, and then he would go on to something that would be maybe the Hindu version or something else. And so, instead of having one coherent whole, you just had strata of different explanations that followed each other chronologically and in no particular order.
He turned philosophical in the end. Now, either he went nuts or we just haven't got there yet. We'll have to wait and see who's crazy, him or us.
Fatt later developed a theory that the universe is made out of information. He started keeping a journal, had been, in fact, secretly doing so for some time, the furtive act of a deranged person. The term journal is mine, not Fatt's. His term was exegesis, a theological term meaning a piece of writing that explains or interprets a portion of Scripture.
When Phil explored the idea that someone was transmitting those visions to him, he couldn't decide whether it might be our government or Russian communists or whatever.
During like 74 and 75, he received some puzzling, unexplained piece of paper in the mail. And he said that he had taken one look at it and instantly said, "Don't show it to me, it's a disinhibiting signal."
And on one particular day, Phil ran up the stairs and handed me this letter and told me to open it and read it, but not to let him see it, because he was afraid that it would be like that Queen of Diamonds in The Manchurian Candidate and put him into a trance where he would perform whatever his handlers had programmed him to do when they brainwashed him.
He said he had gone to a socialist kindergarten and that all the kids there might have been sort of primed with hypnotic delayed bombs that they could be triggered to do something about later in life.
And this was a Xerox of a book review from a left-wing or communist newspaper, but certain words were underlined, some of them in red and some of them in blue, and all the underlined words had to do with death, destruction, rotting, and that sort of thing.
But he did apparently contact the FBI and said, I have this thing I received in the mail, I have reason to believe it's bad business.
Well, Phil really was paranoid, but on the other hand, that Xerox letter was very real. So it's hard to say that paranoia is the only explanation for what happened to him, because you can be paranoid and have enemies.
Haunted by his ideas and theories regarding his mystical experiences, once again, Philip K. Dick loses control of his domestic life. His marriage to Tessa starts to fall apart.
Just in general, we were not getting along, so I left for one night, and before that night was over, Phil was in the hospital for attempted suicide. Apparently, he had tried to slash his wrists, but that didn't work, and he tried to swallow pills, but he vomited them up. So he tried to run the car inside our garage with all the doors closed, but the car would not run. So he called the pharmacy trying to get a refill on one of his prescriptions, and the pharmacist figured out what was going on and called the paramedics.
He knew Doris prior, and this was right after when Valis came out. In mid-20s, had cancer, wore a wig because she had lost her hair in chemo, and he referred to her as the greatest of my titanic errors.
He moved out to take care of Doris Sauter, a girl who had terminal cancer in 1980 and is probably still alive today. They sent her home because there was nothing more they could do for her, and they told her she would be dead in 6 months, but last I heard she was still alive.
Phil's apartment mine was that one straight up, and his was the one with the door facing this way. Phil and I were friends when I lived here and when I moved out. So I would usually go over to his apartment and cook dinner for him and sit and watch TV with him until about 11 o'clock or so, and then I would just walk over here and come home. When you look at his history, you know, he always was involved with women who needed rescuing, and I think I fit into that, you know, because I was young, I was broke, I was sick, I was struggling to get through school, and he liked being needed. So when you didn't need him anymore, it was like he had no reason to live. He needed a cause.
Phil's whole life has been a tragedy of women. He was kind of the damsel in distress Sir Galahad. He would always pick frail, dying, with cancer, troubled, schizophrenic women and love them and want to fix them.
He was very good at finding young ladies, I think, who needed rescue, but he wasn't as good at providing the rescue. Because really, he often needed rescuing himself.
He had a unfortunate taste in women for women with mental problems, you know, and he would admit this. One time when he lived in Santa Ana, he had to take group therapy in Fullerton. I'd have to sit in the waiting room while he'd be in the room back there with these, you know, losers. And a woman came in, a young woman came in. And as soon as I saw her, I thought, oh my God, that's the most psychotic looking woman I've ever seen in my life. You know, she had like really thin, real long, dark, witchy hair. And she had this big Bible clutched to her breast, and her eyes were just, completely psychotic. And all of a sudden I realized Phil is sitting next to me. He's getting up out of his chair. He's gonna go get up and go talk to her. And I grabbed his arm and said, for God's sake, Phil, please, please, please don't go talk to that woman. Don't. I had to dragging him back in his chair. Don't go talk to her. She's obviously nuts. And he was just, wow, she's the most exciting thing I've seen. And yeah. So he did unfortunately have a tendency to get involved with less than stable personalities.
The sort of generic Phil Dick young lady would be 18 years old, not tall, and of course with long dark hair. The long dark hair seems to have been a kind of totem, emblem, recognition almost. And I don't think it's far-fetched to see that as an extension of his lifelong awareness of the fact that his twin sister died shortly after their birth.
He thought that Jane would have had dark hair. Phil was a blonde, and Jane had died at 1 or 2 months, but his mother told him that she had dark hair. So he was looking for a dark-haired girl to replace his lost twin.
In other words, it's a common theme in my writing that a dark-haired girl shows up at the door of the protagonist and tells him that his world is delusional, that there's something false about it. Well, this did finally happen to me. I even knew that her hair would be black. I had an actual complete sense of what she would look like and what she would say. She did appear, she was a total stranger, and she did inform me of this fact, that some of my fictional works were in a literal sense true.
My name is Joan Simpson, and I met Philip K. Dick through an introduction by my ex-boyfriend. It developed into a friendship. It was never a highly sexual relationship, never. But he was so smart, and he had a good sense of humor. And he was entertaining, and I loved listening to him talk. And we did a lot. We talked. We walked. We had quiet fun. And then he got a little too paranoid, but that comes later down the line. Philip K. Dick was, and I believe it still is, very, very popular with the French. So they invited him to a huge honorarium there on science fiction convention in Metz. Paid for the ticket for himself and myself, and gave his speech, his Metz speech, which he worked on for a long, long time. And he was very happy with the speech. And the speech was really quite horrible.
I wrote out these dreams in novel after novel, story after story. To name two in which this prior ugly present obtained most clearly, I cite The Man in the High Castle and my 1974 novel about the U.S. as a police state, called Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. I'm going to be very candid with you. I wrote both novels based on fragmentary residual memories of such a horrid slave state world. People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I'm willing to talk about it.
And people were shocked. And at the same time, they were pretty kind. They really were. I think it was so awful that people saw that something was really wrong.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
And I was sitting there just going, oh, I wish I wasn't sitting here. I wish I didn't have to be here. And at the same time, I felt so terribly, terribly sad. Really, really sad. Because it was apparent that something really, really spectacular, something really great, had probably gone missing and wasn't there anymore.
To my way of looking at things at my present age, the stuff when he started to get off on the Messiah from, outer space, I found the entertainment value of the work suffered. The fact that he had a bone to pick, I think, hurt the literary quality of it.
That creativity, that big mind, that depth, that exciting brain dynamic that he used to have and write in these novels, and they were deep, they were new, they were a bauble of new thought. They were stretching the boundaries, and that was lost. Couldn't do that anymore.
In Philip K. Dick's later years, he calls upon his mystical experiences as a plotline for the novels Valis and Radio Free Albemarle. According to your reports, it is impossible for us to determine whether these events were the result of a delusional mind or not.
78 to 81, he just says, I wrote and wrote and wrote. Then in 81 came Sandra. Came out of his shell. That's when Phil came back into treatment with me. He was depressed. It was the end of Sandra. So Phil's relationship with therapists always were in between women. And when he was saving these women, he was, in his way, less symptomatic. Because he'd devote all his energy outward, to fixing them, then they would leave him. All the symptoms would return.
His whole life had been very chaotic and unhappy until about 75, 76. And then he got his apartment, which became a condominium, which gave him a lot of stability. And he was finally making what to him was infinite money from, for example, the Blade Runner movie, and from a lot of books selling better domestically and overseas.
And in the time that I knew him, he never was rich. He never was rich. And just before he died, he suddenly started to get rich, starting with a lot of options on his books to be made into movies. And the first one was Blade Runner. The book was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And he died just as Blade Runner was being finished. But he saw the rushes on that movie. He really liked the way that movie had been done.
He was very proud of his accomplishments and somewhat vain about it. That he had become this kind of notable genre writer. And he was making good money.
I'm getting much more critical attention now, especially abroad and especially in France. I'm evidently discussed there now and then on French intellectual TV programs, in articles. This is true too in England and so forth. I am sort of a campus figure, but overshadowed by Ray Bradbury.
In a lot of objective ways and personal and emotional ways, he was coming out on top. Money in the bank, a fully paid for condominium, friends who loved him and took care of him and protected him, relationships that he was involved with, books being published, movie being made, everything like this. So in some ways, he kind of went out on top.
The last session I had with Phil, it was in February of '82, the 11th. He was going to go to Amsterdam. That was the last time I saw him. You know, and then he called me on the phone about 5 days later, the 17th, told me he was being interviewed and his eyes were failing. He couldn't see. And he wanted a psychological interpretation. And I said, Phil, I don't think it's that you can't see. I think your eyes are going. Go to the emergency room. And he reluctantly finally said, okay, I'll go. And I guess whoever was interviewing him, I think it was Greg Rickman, left. A couple hours later, he stroked.
And my memory of it is that Tim came over and the door was unlocked and came over with, I think, Juan and Sue Perez, and they found Phil on the carpet. And he had had a stroke and had laid there, they thought, for about 12 hours or so. This is Western Medical Center, where Phil spent the last week or so of his life in the intensive care unit. I sat in the waiting room a large part of the day and went in during the times when I could go in and visit. I
visited him in the intensive care. You know, thought I could do magic, wake him up, but no, it didn't work. Had a second stroke on the 25th, and I guess on March 2nd, he was flatlined and they unplugged him.
I heard about his death reading a New Yorker review of, I think it was the first of his novels that was made into a film. At one point in the review in the New Yorker magazine, the review referred to the film as based on a science fiction novel of the late writer Philip K. Dick. And that was the first I knew that Philip had died.
Gentlemen, this investigation has been suspended until further notice. Was Philip K. Dick a chosen one who had a visionary perception of an ultimate revelation? Or was he simply a writer with a unique imagination? This is a question that will, for now, remain unanswered.
I think Phil had a lot of doubts about his own sanity at times, his own track record. He was a lot more introspective than I realized. I think he used a lot of his experiences to create, storylines. He knew he was not stable from an early age because he's, I think his first psychiatrist was around the age of 6. So Phil knew he was different.
You know, you have to feel like for Phil, the search was worth something. You know, the reason for the search was the search itself. It wasn't the end, it was the process. And I think maybe that's what kept him going and fueled that, Just like the joke about Disneyland, it's more fun to imagine going to Disneyland than it is to be there. It's kind of like it was more fun for Phil to think about the process of getting the answer than the answer itself.
Phil preferred to ask questions in his writing rather than offering answers. And his major question was, what makes us human? But he couldn't ever find just what it was, so he just kept on searching his whole life.
I think he was, first of all, just concerned to know what was real at all, for starters. I think all of his ideas about what might be behind reality were, he considered them educated guesses.
A lot of people who are very much into the alternate reality thing about Phil's books, the one book they really don't like to talk about very much is the last one, Transmigration of Timothy Archer. You have this portrait of this guy who lost himself in bizarre, weird theories and totally lost touch with reality. That guy is kind of a self-portrait of Phil himself, only a critical self-portrait, where he realizes that, yeah, okay, maybe something incredibly strange did happen to me, maybe, but at the same time, I still have a grasp on reality. And I read it, and when I put it down, I said, thank God. Thank God he didn't die crazy. He didn't die crazy. He wasn't a lunatic when he died.
The changing information which we experience as world is an unfolding narrative. It tells about the death of a woman. This woman, who died long ago, was one of the primordial twins. She was half of the divine syzygy. The purpose of the narrative is the recollection of her and of her death. The mind does not wish to forget her.
The question of what happened to Jane, why she died, the answer is not very clear. To my mind, the most logical thing is that she was not strong enough to survive. But she was, her little body was buried in Colorado at the maternal grandmother's place. And of course, when Philip died, 50 some odd years later, he was buried next to her in that same place. I'm sure he would have liked that. She wasn't exactly completely dead to him, She was in his mind a lot, in some way. Not a very tangible way, but she was there.